Back to first year undergraduate microeconomics. Today we're going to continue our discussion about technology and cost curves. In particular, we're looking at the question, why does the marginal cost curve cut the average cost curve at the bottom of the average cost curve? Just to remind you, last time I drew the marginal cost curve looking something like this. Remember that this part over here, that reflected that at low levels of output, businesses could often reduce their marginal cost, so their total cost would increase, but at a decreasing rate. So they would reduce their marginal cost by deploying their assets better, using their inputs more efficiently as they increase the level of output. But as they increase output still further, businesses tend to increase total costs at an increasing rate, which means that marginal cost, the slope of the total cost curve, is going up. I suggested that in part reflects the costs of bureaucracy. Big firms have administration and bureaucratic costs that grow faster than the rate of output. And I also drew the average cost curve. The average cost curve looked something like this. There are two key points to note about the average cost curve. The first point is that whenever we've got fixed costs, average cost must start up very high. In fact, as we get closer and closer to no output, we're dividing a fixed cost by 0 to get the average cost, and so the average cost must become infinitely large. The second point was that once I'd drawn the marginal cost curve, I could draw immediately the average cost curve where the marginal cost curve cut the bottom of the average cost curve like this. And the question we're going to look at in this presentation is why? Why, once I've got the marginal cost curve, can I immediately draw the average cost curve? And why do I know that the average cost starts to turn up just at this point where marginal cost and average cost are the same value? Well, in fact, the answer's really simple. It's got nothing to do with economics. This relationship where the marginal drags the average down whenever the marginal is below the average, where the marginal crosses the average at exactly the point where the average is minimised, and then where the marginal curve drags the average up whenever the marginal is above the average, that holds for every marginal and average relationship. And most of us already know this from thinking about sports, which is what I'm going to do right now. It's World Cup cricket time. So I'm going to give an example from the world of cricket. We're going to talk about this guy down there. That's Sachin Tendulkar, one of the greatest batsmen of all time, who's recently retired from the game. So he's not participating in this year's World Cup, but hey, if we're going to do an example, let's think about the best, and he's the best. Currently, let's suppose that his average score in a test innings is 54 runs, which happens to be pretty close to his career average. We're going to ask what happens the next time that he goes out to bat. What's the relation between his next score, his marginal score, and his average score? And by the way, if you don't know what cricket is, it doesn't really matter. Think of your favourite sport. But cricket's that English game where two things are worth noting. Firstly, teams play for 5 days and then draw, and secondly, the English really suck at it. First, let's consider the case where Tendulkar, in his next innings, scores less than his average. So clearly he's playing the Australians, and he gets bowled out for, let's say he gets bowled out for 25 runs. A pretty good score against the Australians. But you'll notice that his marginal is less than his average. So what happens to his average? Well, if his marginal is less than his average, if he's averaging 54 but he only scores 25 in his next innings, that's going to start pulling his average down. If the marginal is less than the average is going to be falling. Alternatively, what happens if Tendulkar's next innings, he goes out and he scores well over 54. So let's suppose India's playing England, he goes out and Tendulkar scores over a century. He scores, in fact, 131 runs. What's going to happen to his average in that case? Well, if Tendulkar's marginal is above his average, that's going to tend to pull his average up. So if the marginal is greater than the average, then the average must be rising. What about the third case? What happens if Tendulkar goes out in his next innings and his average is 54, and guess what? He goes out for 54, so his marginal score is also 54 runs. What happens to his average? Absolutely nothing. If his marginal score is 54 and his average is 54, his average stays at 54. If the marginal equals the average, then the average doesn't change. That holds for sports scores. It holds for every measure where you have an average and a marginal, including costs. And our cost curves are just capturing this simple fact. So when we drew our cost curves, we were just reflecting that because the average starts off really high, initially, the marginal cost will be below the average cost. And whenever the marginal is below the average, it must drag the average down. Where does it stop dragging the average down? At exactly the point where the average and the marginal are the same, where the marginal cost and the average cost intersect. They have the same value. So we know the average cost curve must be falling. Can't keep falling, it's got to hit the marginal cost curve at some stage because marginal cost starts rising. So we know these two curves are going to intersect, and where they intersect is the bottom of the average cost curve, where marginal and average are the same, because after that point, the marginal is above the average and it starts to pull the average up. So out here at high quantities, the marginal cost is pulling the average cost up. Out here at low quantities, the marginal cost is pulling the average cost down, and where they intersect is exactly the point where the average cost is minimised for the firm. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.